Hello she fans and welcome back to some spooky Halloween bedtime history. I've got two books here and we'll start with Scottish Murders. There's loads in here, but I want to read about Burke and Hare because I don't know anything about them and I'd like to. And then we'll have some Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edgar Allen Poe, the OG spooky man. Look at that. Do you like my Hocus Pocus nails? They're cool, aren't they? Well, these ones are Beetlejuice, these ones are Hocus Pocus. Yeah, don't forget to like the video and subscribe before you fall asleep. And let's get into it. We'll start with Burke and Hare, shall we? I think we shall. 1827 to 28, Edinburgh. Burke and Hare. In the early 19th century, medical science was beginning to flourish, and the University of Edinburgh was a renowned institution for medical studies, particularly the study of anatomy of the human body. At this time, the only cadavers legitimately available for medical studies were those of recently executed criminals, but as the demand for cadavers was increasing drastically, the number of executions being carried out had gone down into a sharp decline. This was, in part, down to changes in the penal code. The removal of hanging as a penalty for pickpocketing in 1808 set the wheels in motion, and over the course of the 1820s and 30s, the death penalty was removed from a number of other offences. This decline resulted in only 2 or 3 corpses a year being available, which obviously did not meet the ever-growing demand, and over time resulted in a form of black market for corpses. A number of the medical teachers, wanting to protect their teaching reputation, were ready and willing to resort to purchasing bodies when they became available. Naturally, grave robbing increased dramatically. As disturbing as this was, the situation soon worsened, and it was not long before some particularly enterprising criminals began what was known at the time as anatomical killing. Put simply, this was targeted killing, ultimately resulting in the victims' cadavers earning a significant amount of money for their killers. William Burke and William Hare were immigrants from Ulster, originally arriving in Edinburgh as labourers to work on the new Union Canal. The pair worked together for some time, and eventually Burke and his partner, Helen MacDougall, moved from Leith into a boarding house run by Hare and his partner, Margaret Laird. Margaret's late husband originally owned Logg's Lodgings in Tanner's Close, and while not married, Hare and Laird lived together, and were generally assumed to be husband and wife, she calling herself Mrs. Hare. Burke and Hare became firm friends, and with a mutual greed and disregard for honest labour, were keen to identify other, easier opportunities to make money. Such an opportunity soon presented itself when a fellow tenant in Tanner's Close died unexpectedly. The man, known only as Donald, was an elderly army pensioner. At the time of his death he owed Hare £4 in rent. Hare, being aware of the demand for dead bodies in the medical profession, saw an opportunity to regain his money with minimal effort. On the day of the old man's funeral, Burke and Hare filled the coffin with a bag of bark and brought the body to the university in the hope of finding a buyer. After making some discreet inquiries, they were directed to a Dr. Robert Knox by one of his students. Knox was a highly ambitious anatomist and eagerly accepted the cadaver. Burke and Hare were paid £7 10 for their trouble, significantly more than the pensioner's initial debt. Burke and Hare celebrated their easily gained cash, but the money soon ran out, and once again they were seeking an opportunity to earn more. When another of Burke's tenants fell ill, though by no means seriously, they took it upon themselves to relieve his suffering. The victim, known as Joseph the Miller, was plied with whisky, perhaps offered by Burke for medicinal purposes. When Joseph was significantly under the influence, Burke and Hare overpowered and killed him. Their preferred method of murder was to stop the victim breathing by covering his nose and mouth, whilst the other restrained him. This ensured the victim sustained no suspicious markings during death, so that the university received fresh and undamaged cadavers, a significant improvement when compared to some of the corpses that were supplied by grave robbers. Eventually, this method of murder became known as burking. Soon, the money ran out once more. By this point, Burke and Hare had become tired of trying to earn an honest living, and with no more sickly tenants available, were forced to consider alternative options. They decided the best course of action was to lure victims off the street, and in February 1828 they invited a pensioner, Abigail Simpson, to spend an evening with them before returning to her home. Once again they adopted what was to become their standard method of murder, and plied her with alcohol. When she became intoxicated, they overpowered and smothered her. They returned to the university, where Dr. Robert Knox was once again more than happy to take the body off their hands. This time they were paid £10. By now, Burke's partner Helen McDougall was questioning where the money was coming from, seeing no evidence of her partner working a regular job. Deciding she could be trusted, they told her the method of their ill-gotten earnings, and having been enlightened as to the source of their cash, Helen began to play her own part in their evil scheme. The next time, Helen befriended a woman and invited her into the boarding house for a drink. The two women chatted and drank together, although Helen was careful to ensure that her companion drank significantly more, and the woman soon became intoxicated. Helen then went for the victim's husband, telling him his wife was intoxicated and required escorting home. The husband duly arrived at the inn to take her home, Burke and Hare having killed the woman already, then overpowered the husband and murdered him too. Initially, Burke and Hare chose their victims carefully, preferring those who were not easily recognisable, or those whose disappearance was unlikely to arouse suspicion, such as visitors to the town. They also took great care to ensure that they could not be tied to the boarding house in any way, often inviting strangers back to the inn. When their disappearance was reported, neither Burke nor Hare would be linked to them. Their next victims were two young women, Janet Brown and Mary Patterson, whom Burke had first encountered in Canongate, Edinburgh. Mary Patterson was a teenage prostitute, and, mentioning he owned a boarding house, Burke lured the two women back with him. In his usual style, Burke plied them with drink, and Mary soon passed out. However, Janet remained conscious and left the house, saying she would return later for Mary. On her return, Mary was nowhere to be found, and she was told that Mary had left with Burke some time earlier. Janet insisted on waiting until her landlady became concerned and sent a message with a servant, telling Janet to leave immediately. Actually, Mary had been lying dead in the house the whole time, and had Janet become more intoxicated, she was certain to have suffered the same fate. According to contemporary accounts, Burke appears to have played the primary role in luring the victims to the boarding house, and the scale of his activities increased. The next victim was identified by Burke, a local beggar woman known as Effie. Burke promptly murdered her, and was paid £10 for her corpse. He quickly moved on, saving a woman in trouble with the police by claiming that he knew her. Hours later, she was dead, and her body on Dr. Knox's dissection table. Burke quickly found two more vulnerable victims, an old woman and her grandson. Their bodies were sold for £8 to Dr. Knox. As his greed escalated, Burke began to lose control, and became more and more careless and remorseless. He no longer stuck to visitors and degenerates. His next two victims were an acquaintance of his, known only as Mrs. Ostler, and more shockingly, a relative of his partner, Helen McDougall. Although Burke appeared to have no qualms about killing her, on this occasion he did ask that Hare actually carry out the killing. It's not clear whether Helen knew of Burke's plans, or the fate of her relative. Hare was responsible for identifying their next victim, a former tenant of the guest house. Mary Haldane found herself upon hard times. Unable to pay her rent, and effectively homeless, she appealed to Hare for permission to sleep in his barn. Hare agreed, and then killed her. Shortly after, the next victim appeared on their doorstep, Mary's daughter, Peggy. also a prostitute, had heard that Mary had last been seen with Hare, and knocked at the door of the Logs' lodgings, seeking her mother. Hare claimed he had seen her, but not since the week before. He invited Peggy into the house to talk more, and killed her. Both Mary and Peggy were sold to the university, and earned Burke and Hare £10 apiece. The Haldane killings indicate the beginning of the downward spiral. Peggy and Mary were well known in the area, and their disappearance did not go unnoticed. At this point, the logical solution for Burke and Hare would have been to lie low and refrain from killing. They had had a decent run, and had made a significant amount of money. Had they stopped killing then, they may well have got away with their crimes. However, their greed knew no bounds, and they became even more careless. Their next victim was a well-known children's entertainer, James Wilson, known affectionately as Daft Jamie. Jamie was well known in the town and was easily identifiable, as he had a significant limp due to a deformed foot. Jamie was 18 at the time of his murder, but despite his deformity, he was physically very strong. He resisted, and it ultimately took both men to overpower and eventually kill him. This time, his body was sold to the university, but was immediately recognised by several students in Knox's class, who raised questions as to the circumstances of Jamie's death, and how Knox had come upon his body. Indeed, Jamie was a poor choice of victim. He was survived by his mother, who naturally began asking questions as to the fate of her son. Dr. Knox denied to his students that the body belonged to Daft Jamie, but tellingly began to dissect the face first and quickly removed the feet. The next victim proved to be the last. Burke and MacDougall had left Logs' lodgings boarding house by now. Burke and Hare had argued over Burke's suspicions that the Hares were selling bodies behind his back. Burke and MacDougall, angry, had moved out and acquired their own boarding house, also taking in lodgers. Marjorie Campbell Docherty was lured into their guest house when Burke pretended that his mother was a Docherty and managed to convince Marjorie that they were actually related. Burke was prevented from killing her immediately, as he had planned, by two other guests boarding at the time, the Greys. The Greys went out for the evening, and shortly after that, neighbours of Burke reported hearing sounds of a struggle. The Greys returned later that evening and inquired what had happened to Marjorie. Burke told them that she had been asked to leave after being overly friendly with him, which had upset Helen. In fact, Marjorie was dead and hidden in the spare room under a layer of straw. Anne Grey became suspicious when she and her husband were sternly warned to keep out of the spare room, despite her protestations that she had left a pair of stockings in there. When they were left alone for the evening, they investigated the spare room and found the body under the bed. Horrified, they immediately confronted Helen MacDougall, who panicked and offered them £10 a week to remain silent. The couple refused and left to report Burke and Helen to the police. Somehow Helen must have warned Burke, for by the time the police arrived and checked under the bed, Marjorie's body had disappeared. It had actually made it to Dr. Knox's dissection table, and Burke had been paid. Burke and Helen were taken into custody, under separate questioning regarding Marjorie's alleged departure from their guest house. Burke stated that she had left at 7 a.m, while Helen claimed it was early evening. The discrepancy in their story led to their arrest. Shortly after, the police received an anonymous tip-off and duly recovered Marjorie's body from the Edinburgh Medical School. James Gray subsequently identified the body and categorically confirmed it was Marjorie. Shortly after this, the Hares, too, were arrested and charged. An Edinburgh paper published a story on the suspected killers, which included details of a number of the locals who had disappeared. Janet Brown, the prostitute who had narrowly escaped Burke and Hare, heard about this and contacted the police. Mary Patterson's clothing had been discovered during a police search. Janet was able to identify this, and also to identify Burke and Hare as the men who had plied both the girls with alcohol. Despite 16 murders, after a month of questioning, the evidence against Burke and Hare was still only circumstantial. Fearing that they might have to go free, Lord Advocate Sir William Ray offered Hare immunity from prosecution if he testified against Burke and MacDougall. The frightened Hare saw a chance to save himself and readily agreed. Burke and MacDougall stood trial. Both were charged with the murder of Marjorie Docherty, while Burke alone stood trial for the murder of Mary Patterson and James Wilson. Found guilty, Burke was sentenced to death by hanging. The case against Helen MacDougall was not proven, and she walked free. On the 28th of January, 1829, William Burke was hanged. Over 25,000 people arrived to cheer the event in the Lawn Market. In an ironic twist, Burke's body was donated to the medical school for what was known as useful dissection. His skeleton can still be found in the surgical school, along with his death mask. There was much public outcry that James Hare was permitted to walk free. Is that a typo? Should that say that's William Hare, isn't it? But despite efforts from Daft Jamie's mother to bring him to justice, he was released in February 1829. Yeah, that's a typo. There was much public outcry that Hare was permitted to walk free despite efforts from Daft Jamie's mother to bring him to justice. He was released in February 1829. According to rumours, he escaped to London via a postal coach, but his identity was subsequently discovered and he was thrown into a pit of lime by an angry mob. He is reported to have ended his days as a penniless blind beggar living on the London streets. Despite his part in the murders, the significant evidence that he gave probable cause for the murders, Dr. Knox escaped prosecution. However, his reputation was so significantly damaged that he eventually fled Edinburgh and moved to London. Students participating in the dissection of Burke's body made a pocketbook of his skin. This is engraved in gold with Burke's Skin 1829 and is displayed to this day in the Police Museum on the Royal Mile. That's grim. And that is Burke and Hare. Shall we move on to some Edgar Allan Poe? Yes. There's lots of stories in this book, but we'll just do 2 short ones. So, this one's called Shadow. It's a parable. And there's a quote to start with from the Psalm of David. It starts with, Though I walk through the valley of the shadow, ye who read are still among the living, but I who write shall have long since gone my way into the region of shadows. For indeed, strange things shall happen, and secret things be known, and many centuries shall pass away, ere these memorials be seen of men. And, when seen, there will be some to disbelieve, and some to doubt, and yet a few who will find much to ponder upon in the characters here graven with a stylus of iron. The year had been a year of terror, and of feelings more intense than terror, for which there is no name upon the earth. For many prodigies a sign had taken place, and far and wide, over sea and land, the black wings of the pestilence were spread abroad. To those, nevertheless, cunning in the stars, it was not unknown that the heavens wore an aspect of ill, and to me, the Greek oinos, among others. It was evident that now had arrived the alternation of that 794 year when, at the entrance of Aries, the planet Jupiter is conjoined with the red ring of the terrible Saturnus. The peculiar spirit of the skies, if I make not greatly, made itself manifest, not only in the physical orb of the earth, but in the souls, imaginations, and meditations of mankind. Over some flasks of the red Chian wine, within the walls of a noble hall, in a dim city called Ptolemais, we sat, at night, a company of 7, and to our chamber there was no entrance save by a lofty door of brass, and the door was fashioned by the artisan Coronos, and, being a rare workmanship, was fastened from within. Black draperies, likewise, in the gloomy room, shut out from our view the moon, the lurid stars, and the peopleless streets. But the bodying and the memory of evil, they would not be so excluded. There were things around us and about of which I can render no distinct account, things material and spiritual, heaviness in the atmosphere, a sense of suffocation, anxiety, and, above all, the terrible state of existence which the nervous experience when the senses are keenly living and awake, and meanwhile the powers of thought lie dormant. A dead weight hung upon us. It hung upon our limbs, upon the household furniture, upon the goblets from which we drank, and all things were depressed, and borne down thereby. All things, save only the flames of the 7 iron lamps which illuminated our revel, uprearing themselves in tall slender lines of light. They thus remained burning, all pallid and motionless, and in the mirror which their lustre formed upon the round table of ebony at which we sat, each of us there assembled beheld the pallor of his own countenance, and the unquiet glare in the downcast eyes of his companion. Yet we laughed and were merry in our proper way, which was hysterical, and sang the songs of Anacreon, which are madness, and drank deeply, although the purple wine reminded us of blood, for there was yet another tenant of our chamber in the person of young Zoilus. Dead, at full length he lay, enshrouded, the genius and the demon of the scene. Alas, he bore no portion in our mirth, save that his countenance, distorted with the plague, and his eyes, in which death had but extinguished the fire of the pestilence, seemed to take such interest in our merriment as the dead may haply take in the merriment of those who are to die. But although I, Oenis, felt that the eyes of the departed were upon me, still I forced myself not to perceive the bitterness of their expression, and, gazing down steadily into the depths of the ebony mirror, sang with a loud and sonorous voice the songs of the son of Teos. But gradually my songs they ceased, and their echoes, rolling afar off among the sable draperies of the chamber, became weak, undistinguishable, and so faded away. And lo, from among those sable draperies, where the sounds of the song departed, there came forth a dark and undefined shadow, a shadow such as the moon, when low in heaven, might fashion from the figure of a man, but it was the shadow neither of a man nor a god, nor of anything familiar. And quivering a while among the draperies of the room, it at length rested in full view upon the surface of the door of brass. But the shadow was vague, and formless, and indefinite, and was the shadow neither a man nor god, neither god of Greece, nor god of Chaldea, nor any Egyptian god. And the shadow rested upon the brazen doorway, and under the arch of the entablature of the door, and moved not, nor spoke any word, but there became stationary, and remained. And the door whereupon the shadow rested was, if I remember right, over against the feet of young Zoilus enshrouded. But we, the 7 there assembled, having seen the shadow as it came out from among the draperies, dared not steadily behold it, but cast down our eyes, and gazed continually into the depths of the mirror of ebony. And at length I, Oenis, speaking some low words, demanded of the shadow its dwelling and its appellation. And the shadow answered, I am shadow, and my dwelling is near to the catacombs of Ptolemais, and hard by those dim plains of Helusium, which border upon the foul Charonian canal. And then did we, the 7, start from our seats in horror, and stand trembling and shuddering, and aghast, for the tones in the voice of the shadow were not the tones of any one being, but a multitude of beings, and varying in their cadence from syllable to syllable, fell duskily upon our ears in the well-remembered and familiar accents of many thousand departed friends. And on the next page we have Silence, a fable, again, based on a Greek writing from Alcman. The mountain pinnacles slumber, valleys, crags, and caves are silent. Listen to me, said the demon, as he placed his hand upon my head. The region of which I speak is a dreary region in Libya, by the borders of the river Zari. And there is no quiet there, nor silence. The waters of the river have a saffron and sickly hue, and they flow not onwards to the sea, but palpitate forever and forever beneath the red eye of the sun with a tumultuous and convulsive emotion. For many miles on either side of the river's oozy bed is a pale desert of gigantic water-lilies. They sigh one unto the other in that solitude, and stretch towards the heaven their long and ghastly necks, and nod to and fro their everlasting heads. And there is an indistinct murmur which cometh out from among them, like the rushing of subterrene water, and they sigh one unto the other. But there is a boundary to their realm, the boundary of the dark, horrible, lofty forest. There, like the waves about the Hebrides, the low underwood is agitated continually, but there is no wind throughout the heaven, and the tall primeval trees rock eternally hither and thither with a crashing and mighty sound. And from their high summits, one by one, drop everlasting dews. And at the roots strange poisonous flowers lie writhing in perturbed slumber. And overhead, with a rustling and loud noise, the grey clouds rush westwardly for ever, until they roll a cataract over the fiery wall of the horizon. But there is no wind throughout the heaven, and by the shores of the river Zeri there is neither quiet nor silence. It was night, and the rain fell, and falling it was rain, but having fallen it was blood. And I stood in the morass among the tall lilies, and the rain fell upon my head, and the lilies sighed one unto the other in the solemnity of their desolation. And all at once the moon arose through the thin ghastly mist, and was a crimson colour. And mine eyes fell upon a huge grey rock which stood by the shore of the river, and was lighted by the light of the moon. And the rock was grey and ghastly and tall, and the rock was grey. Upon its front were characters engraven in the stone, and I walked through the morass of water-lilies, until I came close to the shore, that I might read the characters upon the stone. But I could not decipher them, and I was going back into the morass, when the moon shone with a fuller red, and I turned and looked again upon the rock, and upon the characters, and upon the characters with desolation. I didn't repeat that, it repeated. And I looked upwards, and there stood a man upon the summit of the rock, and I hid myself among the water-lilies that I might discover the action of the man. And the man was tall and stately in form, and was wrapped up from his shoulders to his feet in the toga of old Rome, and the outlines of his figure were indistinct, but his features were the features of a deity. For the mantle of the night, and of the mist, and of the moon, and of the dew, had left uncovered the features of his face, and his brow was lofty with thought, and his eyes wild with care. And in the few furrows upon his cheek I read the fables of sorrow, and weariness, and disgust with mankind, and a longing after solitude. And the man sat up upon the rock, and leaned his head upon his hand, and looked out upon the desolation. He looked down into the low unquiet shrubbery, and up into the tall primeval trees, and up higher at the rustling heaven, and into the crimson moon. I lay close within the shelter of the lilies, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. And the man turned his attention from the heaven, and looked out upon the dreary river, and upon the yellow ghastly waters, and upon the pale legions of the water-lilies. And the man listened to the sighs of the water-lilies, and to the murmur that came up from them. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I went down into the recesses of the morass, and waded afar in among the wilderness of the lilies, and called unto the hippopotami, which dwelt among the fens in the recesses of the morass. And the hippopotami heard my call, and came, with the behemoth, unto the foot of the rock, and roared loudly and fearfully beneath the moon. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man. And the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I cursed the elements with the curse of tumult, and a frightful tempest gathered in the heavens where before there had been no wind. And the heaven became livid with the violence of the tempest, and the rain beat upon the head of the man, and the floods of the river came down, and the river was tormented into foam, and the water lilies shrieked within their beds, and the forest crumbled before the wind, and the thunder rolled, and the lightning fell, and the rocks rocked it to its foundation. And I lay close within my covert, and observed the actions of the man, and the man trembled in the solitude, but the night waned, and he sat upon the rock. Then I grew angry and cursed with the curse of silence, the river and the lilies, and the wind and the forest, and the heaven and the thunder, and the sighs of the water lilies. And they became cursed, and were still. And the moon ceased to totter up its pathway to heaven. And the thunder died away, and the lightning did not flash, and the clouds hung motionless, and the waters sunk to their level and remained, and the trees ceased to rock, and the water lilies sighed no more, and the murmur was heard no longer from among them, nor any shadow of sound throughout the vast, illimitable desert. And I looked upon the characters of the rock, and they were changed, and the characters were silence. And mine eyes fell upon the countenance of the man, and his countenance was wan with terror, and hurriedly he raised his head from his hand, and stood forth upon the rock, and listened. But there was no voice through the vast, illimitable desert, and the characters upon the rock were silence, and the man shuddered and turned his face away, and fled afar off in haste, so that I beheld him no more. Now there are fine tales in the volumes of the Magi, in the iron-bound, melancholy volumes of the Magi. Magi or Magi? Therein, I say, are glorious histories of the heaven and of the earth and of the mighty sea, and of the gods that ruled over the sea and the earth and the lofty heaven. There was much lore, too, in the sayings which were said by the Sibyls, and holy things were heard of old by the dim leaves that trembled around Dodona. But, as Allah liveth, the fable which the demon told me as he sat by my side in the shadow of the tomb, I told to be the most wonderful of all, and, as the demon made an end of his story, he fell back within the cavity of the tomb and laughed. And I could not laugh with the demon, and he cursed me because I could not laugh. And the lynx which dwelleth for ever in the tomb came out therefrom, and lay down at the feet of the demon, and looked at him steadily in the face. And that is two strange, short tales from Edgar Allan Poe. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you're asleep, sleep well. If you're not, subscribe. Let me know if you want more Edgar Allan Poe. And I'll see you soon. Bye bye.